This is really great to see so many people here today. It's exciting. I assumed we would have a good turnout for this particular talk. And my name is Jackie Huntoon. I'm the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs here at Michigan Technological University. And I want to welcome you to this seminar. This is the Michigan Tech Research Forum, and we started doing these forums so that we could all learn more about what all of us are doing for our research at Michigan Tech. And if you've attended some of the others, you know that sometimes we have a long, extended talk, a single presentation by a single author. And on other sessions, we have several shorter tech talk presentations. And if you work here at Michigan Tech or even in the local area, and you would like to host a tech talk seminar on a particular topic, just let us know, because we can customize it for whatever subject you would like to learn more about. These have been a lot of fun for everybody involved, and I think we've all made some new connections by coming to these that have been really beneficial. So for today's speaker, I'm going to let the speaker's dean introduce you, and the dean is Dr. Sharik, who's the dean of the School of Forestry and Environmental Sciences here at Michigan Tech, and I will give the floor to Terry. And remember, after the talk's over, there's more time for socialization. So sit, enjoy the talk, and then you can have more time to talk amongst yourself after that.
Thanks, Jackie, very much. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see a tremendous number of people here. And I think that, not to put John on the spot here, but I think he will not be disappointed by what you're going to hear here in the next half hour. There are several ways that I could go about introducing John. I've already written quite a bit. It appears on these posters and other places as well. And so I don't want to repeat that. What I wanted to do is to share with you some recognition that John has received from beyond the university, in fact, beyond North America. And so what I want to do is to read to you a letter of support that was written on his behalf for a national award by the Ecological Society of America, which recognizes preeminent ecologists in mid-career. Okay. Now, John is a professor. He's a full professor in the School of Forest in the School of Forest Resources and Environmental Science, and has been in that position for 2 years. He came through the ranks from associate to, from assistant to associate to full professor. In any case, so this is the following from a person who is undoubtedly one of the preeminent animal ecologists in international circles. And this is writing in support of this award. And this person happens to be at Oxford University in Oxford, England. And he says the following. He, referring to John, is the world leader in conservation ethics to the extent that I have just negotiated a high prestige 3-month fellowship to bring him to Oxford next year. He has shaped the entire field. He has influenced science and policy and brought a level of logic and analysis to complicated controversies that is without parallel. His reputation is thoroughly international, and he has name recognition from Brazil to Borneo. And then he goes on to say, he is a force of nature, albeit a courteous and softly spoken one. And I would second to that, and John indeed is all of that. He's a very humble person. And then he goes on to say at the end of this letter of recommendation, I can think of no ecologist in North America who more fully deserves this important honor. And I would certainly second that in terms of my interactions with John and having looked at his work closely. And so with that, I'll just end with a little personal note here, and that is that Turns out that John got his bachelor's degree and actually went on to get his PhD degree here. And he had me as an instructor in his undergraduate work. And I gave him he had a term paper that he wrote for me, and I gave him a C on that term paper. He had never gotten a C before then. He probably never got a C after that. But he really remembers that C. So with that, I'm going to, without further ado, I'll turn it over to John, and he's going to talk to us about, it's not about wolves, interdisciplinary knowledge for a sustainable, just, and prosperous world. So John. Thank you.
So this really is a tremendous honor. I have received honors in the past, but they're mostly from people who don't know me as well as you all do. And to be recognized in this way by people who know me so well, warts and pimples and all, it really, really is humbling. And I do have to say I am experiencing a serious sense of timidity here, because I think I'm being honored in large part because of the efforts that I've made towards interdisciplinarity. And many of you in this audience have been extremely successful in your own right with those efforts. And so I would like to think of this event, the time that we have to share together, not so much as a celebration of me, but instead as a celebration of a value that we cherish and have in common as members of the Michigan Tech community. And in doing so, what I want to do is share with you my own path to interdisciplinarity, and Terry read for you a little excerpt from a letter that I was unaware of until this moment, but it made reference to some time that I'll be spending next year in Oxford. And in some ways, the talk that I'll share with you today is really just a story of how I got to be invited to Oxford, so we can think of it that way. And in any event, if you have also been successful in the path of interdisciplinarity, so then this whole talk really is just a celebration of those efforts as well. And if you haven't been involved in interdisciplinarity, maybe it's because you're young in your career and you still feel like you're mastering your disciplinary knowledge. That's fine, of course. And maybe you've been around longer but just still haven't been involved in interdisciplinarity. That's fine too. And in those cases, maybe this talk that I'll share with you today is maybe some kind of a guide, an example, and maybe, if I could be so fortunate, some kind of inspiration towards that end. Now, just a moment ago, I mentioned, kind of conspicuously, but in passing, a common goal, a common value that we might all share, and I want to draw a little bit of attention to that right now. It's, of course, and you might have smoothed it out from the title of the talk, I'm talking about the Michigan Tech University's vision, which is that we will lead as a global technology university that inspires students, advances knowledge, and innovates. But it's not just those things for any old purpose. It's to a very particular end. And that particular end is to create a sustainable, just, and prosperous world. And really, think of that set of adjectives. Sustainable, just, and prosperous. Is there anything more triumphant than those three adjectives? And just think of it, if you're a member of the Michigan Tech community, that's our job to contribute to that, each in our own way. And if you're a scholar at Michigan Tech, I think, or I've come to believe, that the most important way to bring that vision about is through interdisciplinarity. And I think that in really strong terms. And what I mean to say is that the limits of our ability to be interdisciplinary, I think, is the limits of our ability to realize this vision. And so the better we are at that, the better we'll be at achieving this. And so I'm going to share my story today really as a series of kind of professional vignettes. And I think many of you know that my deep roots are in population biology and also the ecology of wolves and moose. Much of that has been manifest through the work that I've done on Isle Royale National Park, and much of it in close collaboration with Rolf Peterson, also my mentor. I think he's somewhere in the audience here. Rolf, are you around? Very good, thank you, Rolf. And Rolf knows this very well too, what I'm about to say next. There's not a single wolf biologist that doesn't eventually become exposed to or confronted by or sometimes even assaulted with the politics of wolf conservation. And for me, that began about 15 years ago. I was invited to be a member of a panel to talk about the question that's on the screen, whether it would be a right thing, a proper thing to hunt wolves. And on this panel were all the kinds of people you would expect to be there. There were leaders of environmental NGOs who kind of typically are thought to be advocates for wolf conservation. There were representatives of various hunting factions and agricultural interests who are kind of stereotypically presumed to be less enthusiastic about wolf conservation. And there was one scientist on the panel, that was me. I was seated at the end of the table and was expected to come last in the lineup. And the first person said, well, I think there should be wolf hunting, and here are the reasons why. And the scientists at the end of the table, they're going to vindicate all the things that I just said. The next person would say, I don't think there should be wolf hunting, and these are the reasons why. And the scientist at the end of the table is going to justify all the things that I've just been telling you. And then this went on an alternating course until the scientist was up to speak. And I reminded the audience that I was indeed the only scientist on the panel. And what that meant most importantly is I was better qualified than anyone else to know the purview of science, to know what the boundaries of science are. And I pointed out that while science can help us understand that question, is basically not a science question. It's an ethics question. And that's all I said. I didn't say any more, I didn't contribute any more scope to the panel than just that. Now there was a little bit of a setup going on because also in the audience was this person here. His name's Michael Nelson. He had earned his PhD in environmental ethics maybe about 3 or 4 years before I had. And his major advisor is a person named Barry Callicott, who's widely recognized to be what might be called the father of modern day environmental ethics. And again, it was a little bit of a setup because Michael and I had never met, and other people who knew us in common thought that we should get to know each other. And I'm told that Michael leaned over when he heard me say those things and said, I bet I could work with that person. And Michael and I met, and we quickly learned that we had some really common perspectives. And the one thing that we understood or believed is that environmental ethics and environmental science, they both seem to have exactly the same ultimate purpose, which is to forge a better relationship between humans and nature. And that's the end of what those two fields have in common. They have different methods. They have a different sense of what counts as a good answer. They have different judgments of what counts as good questions. And that struck Michael and I as being a little bit unfortunate. We also believe that most environmental ethicists don't know nearly enough about how ecosystems actually work, and that most environmental scientists don't know enough about about the principles of ethics. And so that began a collaboration that still goes on to this day, more than 15 years later. And what has fueled my relationship with Michael, and again, I want you to understand this is just my path to interdisciplinarity, and I'm sharing it in the hopes that it's of value to others. Michael and I spent probably 3 years just talking. We didn't produce anything for 3 years. And we actually, if you just go by publications, we're far more productive now, but communicate quite a bit less. But for those first 3 years, we just talked, mostly trying to penetrate each other's jargon, which is just paralyzing. And a lot of what fueled that was just good friendship. His ability to answer over and over again, why is it that thing that Nietzsche said was so important? And my explaining to him why it is that niche theory might have something to do with what we're talking about, and we were just patient with each other. Basically, one of the things we did is we took some of the principles that are involved in applied ethics, and we just made them accessible to conservation professionals. And to give you some sense of what that's all about, it probably helps to start with just understanding what ethics is in the academic sense. It's basically a formal analysis of propositions pertaining to how it is that we ought to behave. In other words, just take some simple examples. We ought to conserve this water resource in this way. We ought to sustain this forest in this way. We immediately recognize these as being statements about conservation and sustainability, but they are also, essentially by definition, ethical statements. And so conservation and sustainability is ethics in action, whether we recognize it or not, and even if we deny it so. And so it behooves us, especially as conservation and sustainability professionals, to probably learn a little bit about the principles of ethics. And so this has been our motivation. One of the most important tools in this regard is argument analysis. And so just this very simple idea, you can have a collection of premises, they lead to a conclusion, you put that all together, and you call it an argument. Now the connection between this very simple idea on the screen And conservation ethics would be something like this. Basically, an ethical argument is any argument whose conclusion can be expressed using the word should or ought. And so in this very, very simple heuristic, we should drive less. And what's so valuable about this simple idea is that there are only two ways in which an argument can go wrong. They can go wrong if one or more of the premises is false or inappropriate, and it can go wrong if the logical structure isn't right, which means that maybe the premises are just fine, but the conclusion doesn't quite follow from that premise. Those are the only two ways in which an argument can go wrong. And so if you can take an interesting conclusion and analyze it in that way, you may get somewhere. Now, I want you to appreciate that I've taken a topic that has, in the West, 2,500 years of history, touches on logic, a subject for which there have been substantive things learned even in the 20th century, and have explained it to you in like 2 or 3 minutes. I could maybe explain the Krebs cycle to you in just the amount of time, and you might say, oh, that's interesting, but that wouldn't make you experts in biochemistry. And so ethics, especially the way I'm sharing with you now, what I hope is that it's invitingly simple, but you could take it from my word, it's sophisticated enough to keep one's attention for as long as it has mine, now almost 15 years. And to now move on to what is basically a second vignette, and to tell you something about how this might be used. And this is fast forwarding quite recently, just a couple of years ago. You might remember in the news, Cecil the lion. Cecil made news because he was shot by a trophy hunter who happened to live in Minnesota. And it's important to recognize that something like 300 or 400 lions get killed every year by trophy hunters, and this is the one that made the news. Literally a shot heard around the world. And the reason being is because Cecil the lion, he wore a radio collar. And because he wore a radio collar, many people knew his life story. They knew his past, they knew what his intentions and aspirations were, they were clear. They knew what his future was likely to have been up until the point in which he got shot. Those kinds of things, to have a history and to have future expectations, that's essentially what it means to be a person. This is what it means for people to care about things, and that's why Cecil his death was heard about. So all lions have these stories, it's just that we don't know them. The next thing comes from the fact that, well, who owned the radio collar that belonged to Cecil? That happened to be David MacDonald. He is a professor from Oxford. I believe he may have been the person who read some of the excerpts from Terry's letter. David MacDonald is easily one of the top 3, I would say, mammalogists on the planet, and he's probably one of the top 5 lion biologists on the planet. And the way that you get to stay on being a lion biologist is to keep your mouth shut about trophy hunting. Because when you work on lions, you're obviously working in some nation where the lions live, and most African nations don't really care what Westerners think about trophy hunting. And David understood those rules, and he was fine to live by them until Cecil got killed. And the trouble with Cecil's death was that suddenly everyone else started saying what David thought about trophy hunting. And in many cases, it wasn't what David thought, and that bothered him deeply. And so he felt he had to say something, but he didn't feel quite qualified to know how to put it together. David knew of the work that I had done in ethics, and so he invited me for a series of trips to meet with him and his team of lion experts to help them think through this question about trophy hunting. And to give you some sense of what the deeper issue is can be illustrated just a little bit by this very, very simple, and it's intended to be a heuristic argument that's on the screen. Basically, it's not the question, is trophy hunting of lions okay? That's a good question and could be addressed. The question that perplexed David is it okay to trophy hunt lions for the sake of conservation? And here you need a couple of facts. The basic idea is that in many places, lions live in places that are not formally protected, but at the moment it's good lion habitat. But the motivation to keep it good lion habitat are landowners and managers who get quite a bit of money from trophy hunting. And the fear is if trophy hunting disappears, so too will the motivation to protect the habitat. So we're not going to, in this talk, hash through all of that, but that's the essence of what's going on. And so I helped David with his team assemble an argument. I have intentionally made it too small to read from where you're at, because I don't want the focus of the talk to be about dissecting the argument, but I want to say a few things about it. You can certainly tell from where you're at that there are more premises, there's about 6 of them, and each of the premises has quite a few more words. This means, among other things, that just even evaluating whether the premises, each individual one, is is true or appropriate is considerably more challenging. And when you have 6 premises, actually the risk of making a logical mistake is considerably higher. And what's worse is there's a chance of making that mistake and not realizing it. In essence, the rules are still the same though. If all the premises are true or appropriate, and if there's no logical mistakes, then this conclusion is sound. And at this point I should say, well, it's valuable to say, what is the point of doing all this? And I think that we have a misconception that the point of ethics is telling other people what to do. And that's definitely what parenting is about, as I understand it. That's maybe what being a religious leader is about. But academic ethics is not really so much about telling other people what to do. There's certainly a time and place for that. But really it's about taking discourse that might be stuck in some way, and discourse about how we ought to behave, and trying to advance that discourse. And in this particular case, 2 insights that were kind of important. They seemed simple in retrospect, but one of the things is that lion trophy hunting was talked about, even by experts, in rather homogeneous terms, in general terms. And it's important to understand that you can hunt lions in something like 15 different countries. And those 15 different countries have really importantly different circumstances, different ecologies, and that changes the flavor of any conversation you might want to have about trophy hunting. And so that was kind of an important insight that only came from kind of dissecting it rather carefully. Another thing, very, very simply, and at risk of a little bit of hand-waving, is that I think people can appreciate there's this essential conflict between what might be conservation values and animal welfare values, and the people who were involved with this. And I should say that as we were building this argument, it was included a group of people who were not in agreement about this issue. And anyways, this conflict between animal welfare and conservation, it was just, they were stuck over that. What they didn't realize is that you could probe a little deeper into some basic principles of ethics that have to do with consequentialism and some things that are sometimes referred to as deontology or Kantian ethics. And if you probe into that and just educate people about some of those principles, they realize, oh, that you can make advances on how we think and, more importantly, how we talk about some of these things. So anyways, that's the end to which some of these argument analyses and ethical discourse can take place. Next vignette. This also has roots towards the beginning of my career. This is about 17 years ago. Mexican wolves are a subspecies of wolves. Wolves used to live in all the places that are colored on that map. The different colors are different kinds of wolves. Mexican wolves used to live in the orange places. Now there are only about 50 wolves, Mexican wolves, and they live in a small part of Arizona and New Mexico. Because they're covered by the Endangered Species Act, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is obligated to make a recovery plan, and recovery plans are usually made by recovery teams. And I was invited to be a member of a recovery team. At that point, just because of my understanding of wolf ecology. And these recovery teams have basically well, first of all, their composition. 17 years ago, most recovery teams were comprised mostly of scientists, experts in the species involved. And they basically had 2 tasks. One is figure out what the criteria would be for when the species would no longer be considered endangered. Usually that means how many? A few hundred, a few thousand, what would the number be? And then you make a plan for how to get there. And so because it's mostly a bunch of natural scientists talking about it, they mostly talk about population biology and try to figure out the number. I had never read the Endangered Species Act by that point in my life, and I figured since I was on a recovery team, it might be a good idea. And I also soon found out that I was one of only 2 people on the team that read the Act. And it's, it's like 50 pages long. The whole read is a bit of a slog. But the first 10 pages I would recommend to anyone. They're quite readable, they're inspiring in some important ways. And, but what caught my attention in all this, and you have to understand, I didn't know the first thing about the law. I see some people looking out, I read it, what's on the bottom there, is there's a legal definition of an endangered species. And it says that it's a species that's at risk of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. And when I read that, I said, that's interesting. I said, I'm not quite sure that I know what that means, and it certainly seems important. And so in these meetings, I asked a question that was really quite outside my purview. I just asked, well, so what is an endangered species? No one in the room knew, and we, in the legal sense, no one in the room knew. And so we went to liaisons that we had to the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they said, oh, well, don't worry about that, because we have policy that's being made right now about that. I'm like, wow, that's wonderful, because I imagine this is kind of complicated, and policy would be very helpful. I said, could you share with us that policy? And they said, no, we can't. And I said, really? I said, well, that's probably not a policy if you can't share it with us. And they said, well, no, it's draft policy, and we're kind of working through it, and it would be premature to share it with you now. And I said, oh, I get that. I said, could you send somebody to us that can maybe just tell us verbally or give us some guideposts? Because we're here at your bidding, and we want to give you good advice about when red wolves would no longer be considered an endangered species, but we can't do that unless you could tell us what an endangered species is. And I said, we can certainly do that on our own, but if you guys are working on it, I was told to stop talking about that. We're not exaggerating, I was taken out in the hallway and told, you really should stop. I was told, you're going to lose. And I said, I'm not interested in winning or losing. I said, I want to get a little closer to the truth. And so when I was told not to talk about it, I wrote a paper about it instead. And so the paper showed up, I think, in maybe 2006. It was published in Conservation Biology. And what was discovered is that there was this little-known feature of the Endangered Species Act, the definition of an endangered species, that had this important vagueness that had never been appreciated. It hadn't been appreciated 30 years after the Act had been created. That led to a flood of papers. Each one of these papers that I'm showing you are from a different team of researchers. Each team of researchers has contributed several papers. There have been, since this time, about 6 lawsuits, federal lawsuits, that have hinged on this issue. And the most honorific thing for me, anyways, is that I was allowed in the past year to testify both before the United States House and the United States Senate about this particular issue. So it's the title of the talk. It involved wolves, but it certainly was not about wolves. It was about these larger issues. I also, today, kind of more recently, have become interested in this question as a social science question. What is it that most people think it might mean for a species to be endangered? And for that, I've worked with a fellow named Jerry Bruscotter from Ohio State University, and somebody you may know better because he's more close. Is Adam here? Is it possible that he might be here? He couldn't make it. Anyways, Adam is from Michigan Tech as well. And Tom is in the audience. Tom, raise your hand. Tom's actually the person that's going to do all the work. Adam and I are just going to tell him what to do. And so anyways, next vignette. A decade later, this is going back just a couple years now, we're still thinking and wondering about wolf hunting, in this case very particularly in Michigan. In 2013, the Michigan Department of Natural Resources proposed in writing, in a formal way, some plans for what a wolf hunt might look like. Plans that they were kind of pursuing quite seriously for the purpose of enacting them. The little river band of Ottawa Indians had very deep concerns about that plan. And because they have treaty rights, they have a formal legal stake in any such conversations. And so they got in touch with me and asked me if I could help represent some of their ideas in their negotiations with the state. So I said yes, because I shared the same concerns. That led also to a paper that was published in the Journal of Mammalogy. And what's important, again, is that it involved wolves, but it really was not about wolves. It was about governance of natural resources. And I was able to give this talk on one of my recent trips to Oxford when we were ostensibly talking about lions. And it was in giving of that talk that I was offered a fellowship to spend a few months in Oxford. And the focus and subject of the fellowship is to talk about governance of natural resources. A little bit about Isle Royale. I'll say very little of it here because so many people are familiar with it and have had many opportunities to hear about it. But again, this is another case where it involves wolves. But I quickly recognized right from its very inception, it's not about wolves. It's about how and whether we respond to climate change in our protected areas. And by recognizing it as that kind of an issue, it got coverage in the New York Times. It was covered in journals like the Natural History, popular journals, and it also allowed me to develop what is today a still strong relationship with Senator Barry Peters, because he's deeply interested in the issue as well. And so anyways, that's the story of how I came to be interested in interdisciplinarity. And if I can go back to just to say, I want to maybe make just one or two very simple, what I think are important lessons about it, but the most important lessons would be provided by you, because it's just a story of my life, and you probably would know better the lessons than me in some sense. But here's one important thing. When I first met Michael Nelson, the ethicist, I was still reasonably early in my career as an ecologist, and I had to make a very difficult choice about my reading habits. Because I still had plenty of room to become a much better wolf ecologist and population biologist. But you can't become good at another field unless you devote some pretty serious time to reading. I love talking to Michael, but just talking to him wasn't going to be enough. I had to really be able to read this stuff and understand it myself, understand how they write about it and all that sort of thing. And it's a terrible, horrible trade-off. And I think the best advice that I would have for, in particular, a young person who might be interested in interdisciplinarity is do your best to manage that trade-off well. I don't know if everyone would agree with this, but I happen to believe, and I can even appreciate that it's arguable, it's very valuable to become an expert in your discipline. Mainly because most audiences are disciplinary. And that's who you have to impress. And so, but nevertheless, you still have to manage that trade-off between becoming an expert in the one thing and then becoming an expert probably what would be amount to one other thing. Maybe just one other thing, and then I'll be done, is that maybe people have seen things like this. There are these different words that I know are familiar, and then there are these different attractive-looking shapes and colors. And sometimes I wonder what these models are supposed to reflect, and sometimes they're just aesthetically pleasing to look at. And maybe just one bit of commentary about at least what I've come to understand about the top two levels is that, and here I'm speaking in some ways kind of personally, and in some ways with a little bit of pride, but maybe some ways just descriptively about the team that I work most closely with. Again, Michael Nelson, an environmental ethicist, Jeremy Bruscotter, who I've worked with for approaching 10 years now. He's a social psychologist, and then myself, the ecologist. Each of us has cared enough about the other person's discipline that all three of us make really pretty substantive contributions to ethics, when we're talking about ethics. And Michael, the ethicist, he will always be vital for making sure we don't go into the gutter, because Jeremy and I would do that in a heartbeat. But we still are contributing substantively because we've taken so much time to understand that person's discipline. And same with social science. When the three of us are meeting there, we're all making really substantive, deep, meaningful contributions. Jeremy will forever be valuable for making sure we stay out of the gutter. And then, of course, the same is true for ecology. Michael and Jeremy both have become competent ecologists over this time. And so I think the difference between those top two levels is that in transdisciplinarity, I think every single member of the team is kind of seriously competent in at least one other field besides their native field. And so anyways, if I could tweak the vision, I might add just the one word, interdisciplinary, but really it's a celebration for all of us. What a great place that we work at where this really is sentence number one in our job description. Thank you so much for all the time. It was a great honor.